A very good morning to you. I'm excited to be looking at 1 Samuel 30. As I've said before, was one of my favourite stories in the Old Testament. I'm surprised it's not a very well-known story. Everyone tells the story of Daniel in the lion's den and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego going into the fiery furnace and all that, and David and Bathsheba, but they don't talk about David and Ziklag. Now, if you look back at 1 Samuel 27, verses 5 to 7, it tells you about how it came about that David and his men settled in Ziklag. And they had been living in Ziklag for about 15 months at this time. So they were well settled there. They had families that were living there. Everything that they owned, they'd settled. They were no longer nomadic, running around from place to place, evading Saul. And so this was home for David and all his men. And the chapter begins, now David and his men, when they came to Ziklag on the third day. Now this is important. If we look at the end of the previous chapter, the Philistines have got uncomfortable at the thought of David being part of the army attacking Israel, and they send him home. And he sets out, as it says in verse 11, early in the morning. And then it says, they came to Ziklag on the third day. So these men had been walking, probably marching, but they'd been on their feet, travelling for 3 days. And they come over, I imagine them coming over the brow of the hill and looking down at Ziklag and seeing that the Amalekites, another enemy of the area, had, while the Philistines were out of the way, had raided Ziklag. And they'd raided that part of the land, the Negeb, and they had burned Ziklag with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Now here is our opportunity to see David at his worst, the worst possible moment in his life up until that point. Everything that meant anything to him was gone. All his 2 wives, his children, and all the children and wives of all his men were gone. 600 men, everything gone, and the whole city burned with fire. And he's tired, and his men are tired. They're weary. They've been travelling for 3 days, and they've been looking forward to getting home and seeing everybody. Now we can empathise with that. You know, I had this experience last weekend of seeing my family, members of my family, for the first time in 2 years. And it was wonderful to see them, to be with them. It was wonderful. And I can only imagine what it felt like for David to know that his entire family and the family of all his men were gone, and everything he owned had been burned. The houses, the buildings, everything gone. And he was very tired. How sad for him. And verse 4 says, then David and the people were with him, raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. Now that's an amazing verse. David and all his men crying, wailing, weeping till they had no more strength to weep. So on top of being travel weary, here they are, emotionally weary, and as low as it's possible to get, desperate. The only thing they have to comfort them is the fact that there aren't any bodies in the city, that it's evident that everyone has been taken. There's no mortal remains. There is a glimmer of hope that the people have been taken alive. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. So not only had all this happened, but his own men turned on him. It was his fault that they'd been away from home. It was his fault that they'd been the other end of the country. It was his fault, perhaps, that they had taken 3 days to march home. I don't know, maybe they'd stopped on the way or something, and that was David's fault. It was David's fault that all this had happened, that they hadn't been back in time to prevent this happening. It was David's fault. And they spoke of stoning him. It brings to mind, as you think about what it must have been like for these men, your heart goes out to them. And they thought, and this is so true of ourselves, isn't it? That when things go really bad, who do we take it out on? Who do we get short-tempered with? Who are we irritated with? The nearest people to us, those who've been there for us throughout all the difficulties up until that moment. If we're sad and depressed and irritated, who are the people who feel it most? It's the people who love us the most, the people who are closest to us, who feel it the most. Because we just lose control of our emotions, our words, our speech and our behaviour in reaction to what has happened to us. And then, verse 6 ends, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David knew where strength lay. Strength lay in God, not in himself. He had no more strength to weep. He had no more strength from his travelling. But the strength he needed lay in God, and he strengthened himself in his God. This was David's secret throughout his life, was to go to God. Always to go to God before he did anything, to go to God over decision-making, to go to sing praises to God, to play his harp and sing to God, to write psalms, to strengthen him. And we see him, there's a lot of people who, when terrible things happen to them, they don't go to church. They don't go where the fellowship is. They don't go to God. They turn away from God. Why? Because they blame God. Why didn't David blame God? Surely it was God's fault that they weren't back in time. Surely it was God's fault that these people had been allowed to take the families. Surely it was God's fault. God didn't tell him while he was away with the Philistines to hurry home. Surely it was God's fault. It wasn't how David thought at all. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. My time is up. I could talk for hours on this chapter. We'll see each other again tomorrow. May God bless you richly, and read the chapter again and picture yourself in that company of men. God bless you. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.